All right. Welcome to the Tuesday, November 22nd meeting of the Hopkinton Elementary School Building Committee 2. I'll quickly review the agenda and then we will get started. We will start with public comment, see if any members of the community are here to offer comment or ask questions. Then for new business tonight, we have to approve some meeting minutes and some invoices. We'll then review and prepare for our next community forum, which is on November 30th. We'll discuss progress on the district-wide study that Perkins Eastman has been conducting. We will discuss the draft educational plan, as well as a market analysis of construction costs that Compass put together for us. We will also review the table of contents for the preliminary design program report, which is the next filing that we have to do with the MSBA. We'll look at some updated test fit options and then confirm our upcoming meeting schedule, hoping to adjourn as close to 8 o'clock as possible, although that's a pretty packed agenda. So we'll start with public comment, and it does not look like there are any members of the public here, so we will move past that, but we can revisit if anybody shows up. The first thing we have on the agenda is approval of meeting minutes, and we all received a copy of the November 8th, 2022 meeting minutes. So does anyone have any questions, comments, or edits for those? Okay. Then does somebody want to make a motion to approve?
I move the minutes of November 8th as written, sir.
Is there a second?
I second that.
Okay. Motion by Mike, second by Jagroot. And we are all here today, so we don't have to do a roll call. All in favor?
Aye.
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 Opposed? Are you abstaining?
Wasn't here.
Okay, and one abstention. So it passes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 with one abstention. Okay, next up, we've got to pay some bills. So we have two invoices in the packet tonight. The first one is from Compass Project Management in the amount of $8,397. The second one is from Perkins Eastman in the amount of $32,760 for a total payment of $41,157. So does anyone have any questions on the invoices? Okay, if there are none, then I would look for a motion to approve the payment of two invoices, one to Compass Project Management for $8,397, and one to Perkins Eastman for $32,760.
So moved, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, is there a second?
Second.
Okay, motion by Mike, second by Bill. All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? No abstentions? Okay, passes unanimously. And as soon as I get a pen, I'll sign it and give it to you before the end of the meeting. Okay, then we move on to prep for the community forum. Chris, am I giving this to you?
Sure.
Okay.
Then we're going to take things out of order. We're going to go to the district-wide study first.
Oh, we talked about that like an hour ago, and I forgot, didn't we? Yeah. Yeah. So we're gonna start with the district-wide study.
Reason for that is just to give color to that. The community forum is a summary of stuff we've talked to you about your past meetings and tonight's presentation. So instead of going through it twice, we're going to go through all the new data tonight, and then we'll have that available at the end. If you want, we can kind of quickly click through it, or we can just talk to the points itself. But it'll be a regurg of what we're going to talk about tonight, plus past meetings. So I'm going to turn it over to Bob to talk about the district-wide study update. So this is that parallel process that's going on. You remember the amendment that was approved by both the school committee and the school building committee, and so Perkins Eastman has been very busy on that parallel track, and I'll turn it over to Bob.
Thank you. And to get it started, I think Chris is going to provide us a little bit of background perspective, kind of tee it up.
So when we talked about the district-wide study, one of the things that we thought made sense as a starting point would be if you're new to Hopkinton, or maybe you don't have kids in the district, you might know what's changed in town, but you might not be as familiar with the schools. And so we thought that really talking about growth was a good starting point for how we approach this. And we wanted to approach it from sort of highlighting some of the things. You're the fastest growing community. You've grown by 26% in the last 10 years. Those are things that folks may not be aware of, but in the context of the schools, if you put it in the next slide, we wanted to sort of frame it in a way that people could understand, and everybody understands memes nowadays. So, the schools are the set size, but what you're putting in them gets bigger all the time. And the district has done a great job of trying to accommodate that as best they can, but that enrollment is a big problem, and it's something that we want to get out ahead of and understand. That's really why we're doing a district-wide study. And in the forum, if you go to the next slide, we will go through this in the context of something everybody understands, which is the classic puzzle toy that every parent has probably bought for their child or grandparent has bought for their child, because the piece fits in the hole because the hole's a little bit bigger than the piece. And in the same way with the schools, if that piece gets a little bigger, it still fits in the hole, just it's a little tighter. If it gets a little smaller, it still fits in the hole and has a lot more room around it. But if that grows substantially, that piece isn't fitting in the hole. And with that biggest circle, you can see that when you grow really substantially, like the 27%, or I have the number there in the animated slide, but the 20+% that Hopkins Schools is forecast to grow, you're not only going to affect the school that you're looking at, but you begin to affect the other schools too. You get a piece so big it affects 3 schools. So if you go to the next slide, we looked at enrollment on a year-over-year basis, and also looked at enrollment in terms of grade level. And what we found when we colored them by making red the biggest changes and the darkest blue by the biggest reductions, so red is a big increase and blue is a big reduction, what we found is that you have these waves that move through the school. And you can start to see really clearly here that you'll have a wave that might start, say, in 2002 with kindergarten, or with pre-K that moves into kindergarten in 2013 and 11, and it just continues and it gets darker as more people move into town, as more people have kids, and the waves also tend to have relationships. They're usually a year removed. And when you really look at this in terms of the beginning of the last decade, you see that there's an increase, but there's an offsetting decrease. And what you see as you move higher up is you get a bigger increase and you have a smaller offsetting decrease. And it's really, that's the effect that we're pushing against. And if you go to the next slide, you can see that up until 2017, this was really something that was a reasonable rate that you could plan for. But when you look at the left side of this table, you can see that's the year-over-year increase, but the right side is the cumulative increase over a period of time. And so you can see that with your minimal growth up until 2017, it was something that really didn't have a huge effect. But you start to get into that substantial jump where you're 21.1% by 2023. And then if we're looking over the next 10 years, you've got another 22.2% that you need to accommodate on top of that. And so the study is really about planning for how you accommodate that with what you have that exists now. So, as we said, the district-wide study is a parallel effort to the work of this committee. It's sponsored by the school committee, not the ESBC. And it's really to understand the effect of growing enrollment with two goals. One, we want to understand the needs of the district to accommodate growth. And two, we want to understand the effect of changing those grade levels so that is there a move that we can make that will better accommodate that growth? And so with that, I'll turn it over to Bob to sort of walk through what they found.
Great, thank you, Chris. So what we're looking at are the grade configurations. We're showing 3 tables. At the very top, what you're looking at is your current configuration with your current enrollments and current grade structures. And then the bottom 2 are showing projected enrollments. And the one in the middle is showing your projected enrollments with your current configuration, and just below that is a different configuration with an Elmwood 2-3-4 school, which of course changes the Hopkins to a 5-6 and the middle school to a 7-8. So as far as the district-wide study so far, the purpose for the study is really to determine the current and the 10-year projected space needs overall, how the full system is impacted by the growth and by the different grade configurations. We're looking at all the K-12 schools with current and the alternative configuration. The process for doing this was first to determine the existing spaces and the uses. So we've done that by digging up old drawings, piecing them together. We've gone out to each school to take a look at how the spaces are being used. We've spoken to the principals at each school, and we've tried to identify what the current snapshot, what the current uses are in those schools. We also have taken a look at each school from a point of view of the circulation, the deficiencies that might exist, the challenges that might exist with corridor travel or stairwell travel, as well as restroom constraints. So if there are too few fixtures or if there's too far to go, this is all good information that will factor in when we get to the point of mapping out some solutions. We'll want to take these things into account. As far as the space needs go, the way we've addressed how we calculate what the future needs are is to begin with the MSBA's guidelines, and from there we modify them to Hopkinton specifics. So one example might be special education programs, where the MSBA just has a quick calc to approximate needs, but we know exactly what the special ed needs are and we can project those forward. So those are specifics that we've built in. And we've also had conversations to refine with the educational leadership team what else we might adjust. So an example of that might be if the classroom, the student enrollment is the real need, do you necessarily scale up all custodial spaces in rooms, or do you just scale up the ones you need? Does admin need to entirely grow proportionally, or is it counselors and a few select offices? So we've tried to put a fine lens on what the future space needs are. And then there are some assumptions built in as well. So where we get a total net program that we think represents the projected enrollment needs, there's a 1.5 net to gross formula that is customary and pretty much understood as a rule of thumb to determine what the overall building size would be. So the reality is it could be less, it could be a little bit more, it would probably be less. And as we get deeper into the study and we see real plans, we'll be able to get refined numbers. But for right now, they're approximated. And at the bottom of the screen on the left here is an example of a space summary. So we've put that all in to track existing, proposed, and see it adjacent to the MSBA standards. So to look, just as an example, we've chosen the Elmwood School to maybe look at one school as an example. This is a program plan. So this takes the existing school with modulars, looks at how each room is being used primarily, and it's color-coded accordingly with all the square footages. This is a space assessment plan, so I think the town has seen these before. This does not tell you how many spaces you need, but it evaluates each space compared to the MSBA standards. So is it is the cafeteria adequately sized or media center adequately sized? This tells us by showing green if something at least meets the minimum standards, and yellow if it's undersized by 10 to 20, or red if it's undersized by 20% or more. This also takes a look at as an example, the Elmwood floor plan where circulation points, where we can see where there are congested areas or stairwells, where there is insufficient plumbing. So this is all part of the record, will be part of the report, and certainly summarized as we pull it all together. This is an example of the space summary. It actually occurs over many, many lines, 2 sheets, but the far left tracks the existing conditions. Again, the middle tracks projected needs, and that's for both the grade 2-3 and the grade 2-3-4 configuration for Elmwood. And the far right are the MSBA guidelines, again, with those 2 grade configurations. What we're also doing as we track the spaces in the margins here, we're listing out the reasoning behind the selection. So if there was a reason why we used guidelines, that's noted. If there was a reason why we didn't and we went with the existing conditions, that's also noted. So it's a good record of how the decisions were also made. So this is now a work in progress still. This is a snapshot of all 5 schools. And what it does is try to just compare what would they be designed for enrollment right now. So if we look at additions and modulars, or in the case of Marathon, planned construction that's underway, what would they accommodate from a design point of view? It tallies the number of classrooms, which we can determine the ideal number of students per room, and what that would lead to as a form of capacity. So we can see the first line of numbers tallies up those classrooms, how many students per room, and comes up with an enrollment. We can see the Marathon here at 662 is what we come up with. And again, this assumes that the work underway has been built, so rooms are restored. That's your current enrollment is 661, so you can see it's pretty close. It's accommodating your needs right now. And if we look forward 10-year projections, we can see that there's, across all the schools, there's certainly more space that will be needed. What I see in this is that at the elementary levels, you are right on, near, or slightly under what your current capacities, your design capacity would be. It doesn't mean you can't repurpose rooms or put more students per classroom, but they're kind of right on the line. Seems like there's a little bit more wiggle room in the middle and high school, but this is only current, so as we get deeper into the next 10 years, the needs for more space are going to continue.
And just one more thing on that, Bob. I think when you look at this, there's something that you should take into account, and that is that the current approximate design that's given there for Marathon is based on after the new addition is built.
Yeah.
So if you take out the, I think it ends up being 88 or 87 students. I think if you take out 88 students, you have a deficit at Marathon right now until that addition is built versus what it was originally designed for. And so those 87 students, if you think back to the enrollment slide we have where we illustrated the waves and the way it moves from grade to grade to grade, when that wave starts to move through the school, you might have room in the middle school or the high school now, but as that wave gets there, you're going to find that it quickly catches up. And so the deficits that this is showing at both Hopkins and Marathon will continue to have an effect as time passes with the students that you know are coming now.
And that's captured in that projected enrollment though, right?
Yes.
So that would show the effect.
The projected enrollment would be 10 years
10
from
years
now.
from now, so it would theoretically show those waves starting to come through, because it's a 10-year, is it a 10-year average?
It's
Or
a
is
10-year average.
10-year average,
For each
okay.
grade, yes.
And so, but keep in mind, 10 years, it's definitely a problem, but
Right.
with, I think the 4th grade right now is rather large compared to some of the other grades. That's a problem that's going to make its way into Hopkins or through Hopkins and into the middle school and into the high school and be an effect that you see now.
Yeah, and I think that's why the delineation of a 10-year average is important, because right, that wave could be hitting in 2 years or
Yeah.
1 year. So that's not a projected enrollment 10 years from now. That's sort of, yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
given the size of grade 4, we'll be asking for 2 fifth grade teachers for next year, which means that we don't really have technical classroom space for that now. So we are, juggling spaces already thinking about doing that for next year. And if that building's going up another 160 kids, we need space.
Could I ask a fast clarifying question? When it says approximate design, is that what the building was originally designed for? Or is that, what does that mean, approximate design?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that. It is not what the building was originally designed for. If we did that, it would not be current with special ed needs or even students per classroom. Those things have changed significantly. So it's a current lens on the design, so the number of rooms. So using current classroom targets, already having some spaces, probably more spaces dedicated to special education than it was originally designed to have. So it's a kind of a current lens on an existing facility.
Okay.
So is current capacity?
I almost use the word capacity, but you can always put more students per room than your target, so capacity can be
Okay.
kind of a moving target
Makes
as
sense.
well. So this matrix here shows that same information and a little bit more. All of the gray rows represent your current configuration, and the yellow represents the new configuration. So if Elmwood goes to 2, 3, 4, again, Hopkins 5, 6, and middle school 7, 8. From left to right, we can see the existing enrollment. And one thing that you can get tripped up on is the fact that pre-K may have an enrollment of, for example, 101 students, but some are half-day, some are AM, some are PM. So we try to interpret that to FTE, full-time equivalent, for the sake of understanding what the school can accommodate. So we see existing enrollment projected, the 10-year average. We see existing square foot, and I've only, I think wherever you see an asterisk, you can go to the first column and see what that means. So in the case of Marathon, again, we are already including that 4-room addition. The projected space needs, the projected, space needs, I think there might be something wrong with that title, but what we're seeing is the total size of a potential addition, and then maybe the delta, what that is, an additional so many thousand square feet. The reason why the square foot numbers are smaller is that, again, it's not an exact science. Just the 1.5 net to gross multiplier could change these numbers. So we've highlighted the needs in terms of classrooms, related art spaces. So you can see as we go further to the right, we put it in terms of general classrooms, related art spaces. So for the Elmwood School, for example, we can see 9 additional classrooms will be needed, plus some special education and ESOL rooms. The 3 related art rooms would be required. One of those includes a gymnasium, and a gymnasium station or room is 3,000 square feet. It's a half gym basketball court, basically. So all of this is recorded. There are notes off to the side, again, that matches what's in the space summary. If a library was kept, even though it might be considered undersized, but considered still useful for an increased enrollment. So this is really a place where we've recorded all that. And then we've also interpreted it a little bit graphically. So the entire top row of all 5 schools here is your current configuration. The bottom row is the different configuration. You'll notice that the Elmwood School does not show up when we go to a grade 2, 3, 4, and that's because, as this committee knows, when we studied a grade 2, 3, 4 ad reno to the existing school, it didn't work. Too many floors, too many stories, too tight overall. So that's why we're representing it with a diagram of a new footprint. But this graphically puts the square footage estimates into scale compared to the existing building. And of course, these could be multi-story, so it doesn't mean it's entirely a 1-story addition. In the focus, really, we want to zoom in on are the schools that are affected by this project, by the 2 different grade configurations. That's looking at Elmwood, Hopkins, and the middle school. The last couple of points, as far as the progress that we're making so far, as Chris pointed out, when we go back and look at the current enrollments and the configuration, we see that overall, there's a 22.2% projected increase in the enrollments. If you were then to look at the lens of what this project is, the Elmwood School, if it were the grade 2-3 structure that you have now, that represents 16.2% of that 22% of that increase. And if it were a grade 2-3-4, you're actually addressing 83.8% of the increased enrollment.
And that's really something for this committee as the ESBC to take away from this. If you think about enrollment as the challenge that the school has to deal with, the Elmwood project has the capacity in a grade 2-3-4 configuration to deal with over 80% of the enrollment possibility in an MSBA funded project.
Any questions? Still a work in progress. Coming together.
I guess I have a question. 10 years from now, we're looking at these numbers, looking at the numbers as they are in 10 years. A lot's happened since 2017. We've had 2 giant apartment buildings built in town. We've had Legacy Farms, which is 700 single-family units built in town. I'm the guy that issues the permits. We don't have anything like that on the radar screen going forward. So in 10 years, yes, we've had this giant growth in the short term, and that's what's affecting all this. In 10 years, are we going to be closing schools? In other words, we're not going to have more kids, a lot more kids come in, other than the families that are already here, I suspect, because there's not that much more room. A lot of single-family homes, but they don't amount to much. We don't have any apartment buildings on the, on the radar screen. I don't want to be sitting here, I won't be sitting here 10 years from now, but I don't want to be sitting here 10 years from now and say, God, now the schools are too big, what are we going to do? Maybe we'll put 2 together. It's going to be a question. And I just want to have somebody, give me a feel-good answer that, no, Mike, it isn't going to turn like Framingham. Framingham closed 4 schools because they had this giant growth thing. They all went crazy. They built all these schools. And then 10 years later, they started closing schools because they had this blip. We got a big blip, of course we do. And, I suspect there's no way to be able to figure that out 10 years from now, but the unprecedented growth we've had right now is attributable to all the apartment complexes, the single-family homes, and the fact that the schools are outstanding. Everybody wants to be here. And hopefully 10 years from now, they'll still want to be here. But I guess what I can't get my hands around is we're not going to have this big influx again. How do you figure stuff like that?
I'd love to let that hang rhetorically, but I also know.
I'm comfortable to answer any way you want.
Well, no, the reason why enrollment projections only go out 10 years, because it is speculative. And beyond 10 years, they get even further off from an estimate. I know when the MSBA probably began the relationship with the district, we weren't there, but their demographers work with the town, and the towns had their own demographers, and things like developable land plays into account. I don't know what the exact numbers are.
Yeah.
I think the thing is, though, that the spike in growth we had, you highlighted, is about those apartment buildings and Legacy Farms and all of that. So the capacity,
The kids will still be
the
there.
kids will still
Just
be
get older.
there. They'll get older, and then what we've seen as a continuing pattern in this town is they'll get older until all of a sudden they get younger because they graduated, they sold the house to a young family. And so while we might not continue on the upward trend,
Yeah.
because of the
We still need the
capacity, it's
space.
unlikely we're going to go down. And so I think that's where and I'm going all the way back to when I was on school committee, I've been looking at these projections, and I think that's what you see, is that capacity growth has caused this, and unless we start knocking down houses, I don't think we're going to see that drop off.
Yeah, I think our old demographer too used to use simply cohort survival. And the two demographers that we have most recently worked with are looking at birth rate data, and they even drill down to say, how many, they will look at the census and say how many women of childbearing years are living in the town of Hopkinton, and when do women in Hopkinton typically have children? Is it between the ages of 20 and 23, 23 to 26? And so as they look at all of that, real estate transfers, housing permits, all of those things are weighed in. So it's now far more scientific, I think, these predictions than they ever have been. But I think, as Bob said, they really are just predictions. And both demographers will say the science we're using is really good, but at the end of the day, it's like catching smoke.
Yeah.
So.
I do think that, again, going back to the days of years ago on the school committee when the demographer used to come in and the numbers would reflect a reality that we all saw was not true in this town.
No.
And I distinctly remember that at one point he came in and said, and I know, it reminded me when Chris had that slide up that said Hopkinton was the fastest growing Boston area community from 2010 to 2020, because he flat out admitted, he said, this breaks the model. None of what is happening in Hopkinton fits any of the models we've used before for this extreme growth, and so I think that's what we've been facing from a planning perspective too.
You also have to look at it in terms of the compromises that you've already had to make in your existing school building.
Sure.
Even if your enrollment shrunk, it would give you the opportunity to reverse some of those compromises so that you wouldn't have as many teachers teaching in facilities that weren't designed for that purpose.
Yep.
In the same way that we go back to the sort of the metaphor that I started with, which is, you design that toy so a slightly smaller piece fits in that school, just like a slightly larger piece fits in that school, so that you can have a school system that can accommodate a little variation and not have to constantly reinvent the wheel with your schools throughout town.
I just think it's important when we, give this information to the public that we don't talk about the blip from 2017 to 2022. Obviously that's there. We know what happened in that time. But we've got to be able to articulate what you guys just did pretty well going forward so that, people will understand we're not, building a castle when we only need you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, well, I think that's why
Great point.
That's why we set out with the target to not just educate people who have kids in the school,
Yeah.
but we want to reach the seniors in town who may not have kids in the school and may not
Yeah.
understand what
Sure.
the schools are dealing with, and we want to reach the new parents who might have just moved to Hopkinton because they heard the schools were so great, but they might not be familiar with the challenges that
Yeah.
still exist.
Great.
I also think this transparency is helpful for people who do have students in the school. So sometimes you'll hear families who say, oh, well, I have a first grader, so this isn't going to impact them. We're going to miss the new building.
Yeah.
But the truth is like this does impact them to see what that will look like when they go to Hopkins Middle School and high school. That enrollment does impact them. And our kindergartners and our first graders are in classes of 25 students right now, and that's very large. So we've got to find space for them and for teachers.
I have a question. So if you look at the numbers on the previous slide where it says current design 650, and then for the current Elmwood School, it seems to indicate that the current school building is just right-sized for the current enrollment. And yet, when we look at the pictures where you showed the red areas versus the green, there was a lot of red, which means a lot of the areas are undersized. So how do these numbers? If I'm looking at this, it tells me the current building is just right-sized. Is that really true?
It's never binary. It's really difficult. This chart that we're looking at here looked at classrooms as the driver for capacity, and there are many things that can happen differently. Not that they're desirable, but media centers can take on different shapes and forms. So there is a square footage formula with the MSBA that would cause us to say the media center isn't meeting their guidelines, therefore it's red. It doesn't mean it can't serve the population. It could serve the population better if it were right-sized. But I think it's a piece of the puzzle. So part of it is to look space by space and look at very deficient spaces, and that fed into the dialogue that we had as we were looking at the space summary and the projections for the future to determine on a media center, if it doesn't meet guidelines, does it still serve the student body well enough?
And that question was kind of what I was getting at too when I asked what is meant by approximate design, because I feel like it would be a more powerful statement if we could say the building was designed for 450 students or whatever it was designed for, and now our current enrollment is 661 students. Because I agree, and that's why I asked, I'm like, that seems off to me. I've been in the middle school when the bell rings and you can't get down the hallway, so there's no way it was designed for 1,000 students, because 900 of them can't get down the hallway. So I think this, I get where you're going, but this information is a little, I don't know, it's not telling the story that, it's messing with the story, I think. And I don't know why the approximate design number is what it is. I know you answer that with a current lens, but I think the design was the design for 400 kids, and now there's 600 in my head. And I may have it wrong, but that's kind of how I view it.
And that's applicable to the Marathon School because it was built in modern times and meets the current educational delivery, but some of these older schools have been built over time. And to Gerud's point, you know, equity comes into the equation too, you know, where some of those rooms are red, and when you look at capacity, you may have the same number of classrooms, but some of them are smaller, and when you're trying to fit desks and chairs and the delivery, those teachers may end up with less in that particular room just because of the confines of that exact room versus the more generous spaces. So there are many layers to this onion.
Sure.
And what Perkins is trying to do is it's peel them back and to give you the views in each. And I think it's a charge of the group here to make that distilled in a way that the public can understand, because for each of these, there's a different way of thinking about it. And our job here is to bring it to light and make sure we message it appropriately.
Okay.
Yeah, there was a version I saw of this before, and I think this reflects the discussion that we had, that was just a gross square footage deficit.
Yes.
And the thing about that slide is if you look at the gross square footage deficit, it would be panic inducing.
Yeah, right.
And so because if you look at things like Bob was talking about with the media center, it's like it's below MSBA design requirements for the number of students in the school, but the way in which we use it means that it's probably not quite as, and so I know I had raised, when I saw that version, I had raised the concern of like if somebody just looked at the square footage deficits by building and just added it up and then gets, you know, to a how much does it cost per square foot for construction, which we'll get to later, is that just, again, it would look really, really a big problem. I think what we're wrestling with is how to appropriately express what's going on here so people get the message. But you're right, if you look at this slide, you can almost look at it and say, it feels like we're doing okay right now.
Yeah, we got another year.
Yeah.
No, we don't have
Is there anything that could be done, I mean, following up on this conversation, that maybe 5 years from now, because of the wave, or 7 years from now, we don't need as much space in whatever the new Elmwood School will be? And there was some thought that may free up some space for other students to use. Is there anything you can do in the design phase to be thinking about that not everything in an elementary school will always forever be used by elementary students? Because that may happen here. Has that happened before? And is there anything you can do from a design phase to make those rooms usable by older kids if the space is available?
Yeah, within limits. We're actually working on some schools that are intended to be swing space for everything from pre-K to 12, which brings in a lot of challenges because there are just code requirements for height, different size furniture, reach ranges. So there's limits to what you can do, but one of the important things is to try to work on universal concepts of room size, flexibility, adaptability.
Okay.
And the ability for the entire school to adapt. So, you know, one of the things that we see has trickled up into high schools, for example, is less of a department structure and more of an integrated science structure. So it can work in a lot of different ways for different age groups. It can work in a team model, it can work in a small neighborhood type model. So that might be one hint or an example of where even up into high school you can see you know, sort of teaming and grouping and collaboration becomes one of the constants that you can build into.
So is that something, as a committee, we have to direct you to design swing space, or you do it automatically?
Flexibility, we're charged with designing flexible, adaptable learning
Okay.
environments, and that's also part of what 21st century learning environments are. It's also called future ready.
Okay.
And I think one of the things that we're touching on is the importance of the measuring stick that's used when you're evaluating this study. We chose the MSBA because it's something that's consistent throughout the state in terms of a metric that is used throughout the state for sizing a school. And so it's a good starting point, but there's options within there. The perfect example is the cafeteria. Cafeteria is designed not to fit every student at one time. It's designed to fit every student in the building over a number of waves. And as those waves change, on some of them are at unacceptable levels in some of the schools right now, but as enrollment went down, you may be able to reduce the number of waves so that you maybe have 3 lunches instead of 4. Or in an ideal world, if you're really low on enrollment, maybe you only have 2 and kids actually get to eat in the middle of the day instead of, early in the morning.
When they get off the bus.
Any other questions?
One of the biggest complaints we heard about Elmwood is the number of bathrooms. So that doesn't get captured here, those kinds of facilities, right? Because this only looks at classrooms.
Right, it actually does, and that's why we had seen a number of diagrams. So if I go back to this diagram, using Elmwood as an example, this highlights some of those circulation pinch points, stairwells that are maybe either excessively used or just not big enough and creating congestion. The toilet room, if it's deficient by count, but also by distance. So again, many layers to the onion, I think Jeff said. All information that will come together and inform solutions.
Yeah, I would say, looking at it, from somebody looking at the numbers, to say, yeah, Elmwood's like the perfect size. But of course, we know it doesn't meet what the MSBA requires. Well, the upshot of all that means that the administration and the teachers are doing an outstanding job teaching in a facility that's not big enough for the kids they have. So I think to get that out to the public, it's important. They've been doing a great job. Can you imagine if they didn't have to stay out there and call parents' names out when the kids get on the school buses, and they could actually teach what they were trained to do? And now it's like, how do I ship my kids to the bathroom on the other side of the school? It'd be great if they didn't have to worry about that stuff and do the stuff they were trained to do.
That's why the meme works so well, Mike, at the beginning. They're using the tools that they have to fix a big problem.
Yeah. So they've been doing all that, but it's taken away from the thing that they were trained to do, is all I'm saying. And while you could say, yeah, we can still function like this, people get worn out, people get tired, and they say, no, it's not my job anymore. And,
Do you want to transition to the next topic? All right, so the educational plan. So this is something you'll hear a lot about in the coming weeks. The MSBA has a thorough process, as you're coming to learn, and those of you that were on the last job have understood. And there's an intention with everything they do. The educational plan is a charge they give to the school administration to develop a roadmap, a written narrative, how you deliver the education today and what you want it to look like tomorrow. And the purpose of writing it down is to obviously look at peer towns and understand what's going on in other departments and other school systems, and help influence how you want the vision of this school to look. Ultimately, that forces the town to understand adjacencies, programs, interconnectivity, interactions. Ultimately, that plan becomes a roadmap that the design team takes on after it gets reviewed and approved by the school committee and the school administration, to be a roadmap to lay out the future footprint of the building. So the role of drafting and approving it goes to the school department and the school committee, but it's important for this committee to understand why that is, because it will influence the geometries and shapes and the floor plans that you will look at over time the design is responding to. And I'm going to turn it over to Carol to talk a little bit more about what that is and where we are in the process.
Sure, thank you, Jeff. So Ann Carver and I have been working on this document for a very long time, and we don't work on it in isolation. We have reached out to the directors of PE Wellness, art, music, special education, you sort of name it. They have, their hands on the document as well, so that when we're looking out to say, what is innovation going to look like in these departments in 5 years, in 10 years, in 20 years, we have their vision in that document as well. As Jeff just said, it is a written narrative, and that's what the MSBA requires. So people who might be interested in reading it, it is a long and arduous read. So you may just want to go through the document and find the areas that interest you if you're going to take a look at it. I will reiterate, the document is in fact a draft right now. So the goal is to get the ESBC2 to get their eyes on it, the school committee, the people who are working in our schools, because that's really the only way that we're going to get continuous feedback about what the document says. The document in Hopkinton is also interesting because in other communities, they are typically either replacing or renovating a school, and it's kind of a one-to-one match. In our situation, we have two options. We could build a 2-3 school or a 2-3-4 school. So when you look at that document, there's going to be an awful lot of analysis in there about things like the finances. What does it mean if you build a 2-3 school or a 2-3-4 school? The educational grouping, what does it mean if you build a 2-3 or a 2-3-4 school? If you do pull grade 4 out of Hopkins, what is that kind of cascading effect? When you have the Hopkins building now that's not really large enough, we see, in coming years to house 2 grades, if you only have the 5th grade in there, will you pull in grade 6? And so there's a lot of analysis about programming and instruction. And I mean, it goes so far to talk about things like transportation and extracurricular opportunities and the numbers of transitions our kids make. Hopkinton is super unique in that we don't have like a K-5 school where all of a sudden everybody kind of pools into a middle school. Instead, our kids are together for 5 different school buildings, and there's a lot of research that will say making a transition is challenging for kids. They're in a new place with new routines. It's easy to become dysregulated. There aren't familiar faces. And so if you have 4 transitions for kids as they go from pre-K through 12, it's an awful lot to ask of our kids. So some of the transitional work you'll see in that document as well. I guess the last thing that I will say about this is it's exciting work. I think, Bob, you just used the term future ready, and that's really where we're going with this. We're really looking at what could incredible instruction and programming and curriculum look like as we move into the next 30, 40, 50 years in Hopkinton, long after we're sitting here on the other side of the table. But one thing I do think we know is that we have incredible growth and we have to accommodate that. What this gives us the opportunity to do is really come up with some kind of an amazing design to say, this is great for Hopkinton, it's maximizing teaching learning, and it's doing it in a fiscally responsive way. So I hope people will try to get their hands on the doc. We will be sending it out to the people inside our schools. School committee already has it in their hands. They will be reviewing it on December 1. So if the community wants to get their hands on it, as soon as that packet's released, you will also have access to the document.
And they'll be reviewing it on December 1 for a potential vote to approve?
That will sort of be the first time that they talk about
So-
it.
They'll have, okay. Yeah.
Yes, they will need to be approving it then because we're going to be sending it off to MSBA on December 9. Yep.
All right, so it will be a draft, even whatever point they do approve it, whether it's the first or the following meeting, it'll be a draft approval because it'll go in as part of that submission to the MSBA, which will provide comments, and they will comment on all aspects of it to challenge you, to make sure you've thought through things, asking questions from things they've learned in other districts to make sure what you've thought about. And so then there'll be a revision to that, and that's what gets finalized as part of the second submission to the MSBA, and that's when we kind of lock in the ed program. But it's a draft at this point. But the school committee and the school administration, when they're comfortable, that gets packaged in the first submission to the MSBA.
Questions?
Just a clarification, we'll look to have it approved by the 8th. So if it's not voted on the 1st, it could be voted on the 8th because it needs to be included in the PDP package that we're sending to the MSBA on the 9th.
I'd have a question. It's kind of a follow-up to what Mike said. The reputation of the schools is second to none. And again, congratulations to all of you and your team for doing that. And I happen to be looking at class size policies, the goals that you're looking for, around 22 students for K1, 2, 3, and 4. I wonder if you might get a question from the public saying, well, what is that, how does that compare? That may be what you'd like to have compared to other like schools. Is that higher, lower?
For those early grades, that's about typical.
Okay.
I think when we opened Marathon, the goal was to have about 16 or 17 students in a classroom, and each one of those K classrooms would have its own bathroom. And, you know, we thought kids would really be sort of very independent and get a lot of kind of teacher time. And those classes are now at 22.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, just skimming it, looks like a lot of work went into it, and yet it still seems to be an easy read. So I'll do my best to read through it, but hopefully people will take
Good luck.
advantage of all the work you've done, and thank you for
Thank you.
doing that.
Any questions before we transition to cost? All right, so cost, always a hot topic in every town. What I wanted to do with tonight's meeting is that we have the meeting tonight, and then we have, there's other meetings that happen between now and your next meeting, like community forum and school committee, but we have tonight's meeting, and then we have your next meeting, which we'll be presenting the first level of cost review data, and that'll go into that first submission to the MSBA. So I wanted to take tonight and talk about market trends, because we are much closer to it on our side of the fence with Perkins and Vertex, seeing the bid results of current projects over the past year, but you guys are not as attuned to it, so I wanted to make sure we put that out there. So no surprise, costs are up across the board, right? And so that's, everybody understands that, you know, that COVID caused a kind of a freeze in the first year of 2020, and then really spiked in 2021 and again in 2022, and it's still expected to be up in 2023. And that's important because that ultimately helps influence the number that we bring to town meeting at the end of 2023. And so the first look at cost is next week, but it's important to have a conversation as to why. You know, these slides here at the beginning are about the impact that was foreseen by some pretty big firms, Consigli and Cox Engineering. We have other ones from Gilbane and Turner Construction that kind of fed into this presentation, and where they were envisioning it in Q2 of this year. At that point, they were looking at a 7 to 9% inflation in 2022. Ukraine war had just begun in February in that time frame, really spiking up fuel prices. And the fuel costs are in all the elements that we use to build buildings. And so you can see how that has a ripple effect. Lumber and wood and insulation, all those things were other things that were up in 2021 and 2022. But subcontractor capacity in 2022 was another spike and continues to be high. There's a lot of work out there, which drives the overall cost up across the board. So we go to the next slide. And so Turner is a national firm and also large local presence. And so I want to talk about, you know, where they saw 22. And so that had to do with the pipeline of construction, that there was a lot of pent-up demand. A lot of projects were being bid across all aspects of health, higher education, K-12, life sciences. A lot of work out there, meaning people don't have to be as selective of their projects, and it's reflected in the ultimate price. There was also a lot of uncertainty in deliveries and time, which makes for a more volatile construction market, which means that contractors have to protect themselves on bid day. Lastly, this continues to be an issue. How does this affect local markets? So we found at the beginning of the COVID, there was supply chain issues at the factory that then had trucking shortages, which then led to delays getting to the job site. And what do you have to do on your job site to work around these isolated pockets of delays? And so the actual cost of construction has gone up because of that, working around the challenges that pop up not only on bid day, but along the way of a 2-year duration of construction. Next slide. And so the other thing to report is that previously in 2021 and in 2020, the subs were taking this cost on. You know, they were worried about market, they were taking on the risk. The supply chain challenges hadn't really hit at that point. So they took it hard in those first 2 years, and they've stopped doing that in 2022, which is why the cost spikes have continued into 2022 and will carry on into 2023. They're passing that on to the end user, which in our case is the owner in the town, and those are reflected in the bid prices that we're seeing. Next slide. So this is an interesting slide, and this is factual data provided by Turner Construction, which has to do with from the last recession, you know, where we were in 09, where there was a real drop, and to the increase. And so we average out in the early 2012 to 2019 at that 5 to 6% range of steady increase in overall cost of escalation. COVID hit in 2020, literally the world froze. We dropped to a 1%. People were just trying to keep their doors open. And then in 2021, they had to make up for those losses. So that jumped in 12%. And then the supply chain issues started to happen and continued to climb in 2022, with at that point, at the beginning of this quarter, was a projected of 9 to 12%. So you see a real sustained trend these first 2 years coming out of the initial year of COVID, and we're still expecting a higher number next year in the beginning of 2023 before these things settle down. So what that means in 2022 on the next slide is the data from the MSBA. And so the MSBA pulled aside all the owners project managers to a meeting a couple of weeks ago and talked about where is the trend in 2022 and what they're seeing. Again, we're in the MSBA world. It's a great benchmark for us. And so the next slide. So the data there is to do with, they had 9 projects bid in 2022. And there was a variety of projects, both new construction and addition renovation, both general contractor, which is a lump sum low bid number, or construction manager delivery method. All of them saw an increase. No matter what type of project you had, every one of them got hit. Your project budgets are set a year to a year and a half before through your town funding vote for the entirety of the project. When you look at just these 9 projects that bid in 2022, they were up over 11% from the budgets that were established just a year to a year and a half prior. One of those was really driving it up. There was an ad reno project in the Cape that was $28 million over the budget. So that was a huge hit. So when we back that number out, the bottom line here in the last bullet is that the other representative projects is 8.8%. And that's what we're up. And so that's consistent with how Turner and Shawmut and Consigli and Gilbane all saw this year coming. Initially, they thought maybe 5 to 7%. They were optimistic. And then 9 to 12 kind of towards the end there. And so we're landing in that range of the 7 to 12, and we're not done. Right now, there's about another 5 projects the MSBA has bidding between now and the end of February, when we would be making our final decision. So we'll have 5 more projects worth of data to bring back to you to help inform where the current trend is for the start of 2023, and that'll help influence the numbers that we move forward with when we select a final option to move forward with. But not only does the cost impact the actual construction, next slide, it impacts what we call soft costs. So soft costs has to do with your consultant fees, your third-party testing, your utility back charges that you pay to Eversource, the building risk insurances. So because the cost of construction is up, the insurance is up to go with that for replacement values. The utility companies are also paying more for copper and metal. The furniture and technology you're putting in the building are up across the board. So all these costs are also up at a higher percentage. When we present to you next week costs, it'll be at a very high level. And so there's not a lot of detail, which we'll talk about in a second. But there's the construction dollars, and then there's the total project costs. As a multiplier at this stage, we generally use a 30% multiplier. And so that includes all your consultant costs, your contingencies, which would represent about 5% for your construction costs, change order contingencies. All your FF&E, your technology, and other ancillary costs make up about 30% of the overall value of your total project budget, and the construction makes up the other 70% of the overall project budget. So I wanted to pause and kind of put that into perspective. We're going to talk about the options in a minute with Dan, but when you think about the options now, think about where they are in the process. They're cartoons, right? We're still at the early stage. We're still sizing the building with that space summary template that Bob showed you. And so it's a relative cost. The first look at you get next week will be a relative cost as to where we are in the overall project budget. And so it'll be a range. Both of us will have an estimated look at it. They'll be further apart because we're looking at a space summary size, which is based on the historical data. So we're going to take that market research from the past year and the projection of the escalation on. That's going to come from $1 per square foot on the building. And then we'll make assumptions on the site, looking at the early topography changes, looking at what the size of the parking lots and roadway circulation will be. And that'll develop that initial number. So the two estimators will be kind of far apart because we're still at the conceptual stage. And when we get to the end of February, when you select your option, that'll be a lot more dialed in. We'll have more certainty on the cost. The design team are continuing to work between now and then. But I wanted to pause and talk a little bit about perspective for Hopkinton. right? You bid the Marathon School back in 2016. So in 2016, that project came in at $408 a square foot, right? Nice efficient number back in 2016, so 6 years ago. If we used that Turner chart and escalated just that project, everything being identical and equal, that 408 becomes 609 today. If I look at the MSBA jobs, those last 8 projects, I throw that outlier out there, the average of those are 636. So the current bid pricing that we're hearing today is 636 for those today's dollars projects. So even escalating up the Marathon one, we're still seeing higher overall, and that's reflective partly of today's current year, 2022. Our job and our task is to project that out another 3 years, right? Because we have to still go through the feasibility study for the next year, another year of design, and then escalation is supposed to carry on to midway point of construction. So you project out another 2 to 3 years from now, and that'll get compounded out, which will put us over $700 a square foot, which is a jaw-dropping number, even for all of us on this side of the table. That at only 6 years ago we were, at 480, and now today's dollars we're at 636, and 3 years from now we're over 700. That used to be the number we always put out for lab work and life sciences and hospitals, but now it's creeping in to all the other types of projects. We're bidding police and fire stations that are at that number too, as well. The dollars per square foot is helpful when you're building a larger building. There's a lot of fixed costs on the size of cafeteria and gyms that drop down. When you're building smaller buildings, those are fixed costs. When you have a larger project, you can help share that load. So the dollars per square foot will look a little different in the 2 options that you guys look at for the 2 grade configurations. There's a lot of decisions ahead that this committee can control, and some of them are outside influences and some of them are decisions you make. Over the next couple of months, we'll talk about the sustainability goals of the project. Do you want to be a fossil fuel free project with full geothermal? That has not only benefits long-term from operational costs, but an upfront cost that could be large and jaw-dropping as well. And so we have to weigh the values of the near-term versus the long-term and what the desires of the town and the committee are. We'll also have conversations about whether we go construction manager at risk, which has an initial higher premium, versus a general contractor. A general contractor with a lump sum low bid number will get you a lower bid on bid date, but you'll have higher change orders you battle with along the way. There are benefits to both. Due to the market conditions, CM at Risk has a lot more options currently. So even 2 years ago, it was more of a coin flip depending on the complexities of your project. There are more reasons to go CM now, but there comes with a premium with that. And we'll talk about that again in January and February when we look at the actual dollars. And so those are some of the bigger pictures. And then site development, how much of the site are we developing? Just parking lots, what do the fields look like? And what are we adding to the overall project? So I know I kind of threw a lot at you, a lot of big numbers there, but I wanted to help set the table so when you do see the project specific dollars next week, you understand how we have got there.
Questions?
The only question I had, you used the word traditionally soft costs are 30%. I thought there was going to be a but this time, and there's not. It's 30% on a larger construction budget anyway, so it equals out.
So it equals out. Great point,
Okay.
Bill, for clarification. So like if the cost of, back in '06, I think structural steel spiked and a lot of metal specific problems spiked. And so that was isolated to certain trades. And so a lot of people were arguing at that time, well, the cost of everything else shouldn't go up just because the metal and that material cost more. We're not under that condition now. Because of inflationary times, it does pass throughout. So the cost of everything is up. So we do add that multiplier on top. And I say 30%. We will try and put a closer look at it. So it may be 29, it may be 32, but 30 is the placeholder for this first go at. When we go to the PSR submission in February, I will do a detailed look at how I would build that total soft cost, but I will use a 30% multiplier for this first go around.
So the 700 you're projecting, is that construction or is that all in construction and the
That's
soft cost?
just construction. Which is much higher than we were all accustomed to seeing. And scarily is becoming the new norm, and over the past, over the last few jobs that are now projecting to go to 2023 and beyond.
Thank you. I think.
Yeah, I know. And we'll try and get more cost data. I mean, we got a lot of this stuff over the summer, quarter two, and we'll look for quarter three to bring to you in that January timeframe as well. Yeah,
I
Julie.
have a question on the future escalation. Does the MSBA stipulate a certain rate, or is that really up to the team?
Great question. No, they leave that chance of risk up to us as a community, right? So that they also balance that, you as your community need to understand what you can support, right? And so they leave the funding numbers to a local decision because you have your own aspirations. Do you want to be net zero ready? As an example, there are some cities that are just in dire need of a project and they just get me a bricks and mortar so I can get the students in a new current facility, and they're not as concerned about some of the suburban towns that are really trying to do a push to net zero ready. I'll say net zero ready is becoming the norm on most of our projects, even the city of Boston as well. I don't mean to disparage cities, but that dialogue is happening throughout. But there are opportunities and decision points that the committee here can make of, do I just need an efficient building, or do I want to think about tomorrow and what the operational costs and impact of this building are on the environment? So they'll leave decisions about escalation, because escalation is risk. They've started that meeting a month ago in response to all of us asking them, what are you seeing in other districts and what's going on? Because towns have had to go back to the well. Of those 9 projects, I think 5 or 6 of them had to go back for an override, and the other 3 were able to absorb, $1 million to $2 million hits within their overall budget and didn't have to go back to the town. But some of them had to go back when they were significant numbers. So.
I just have one more question relating to costs, and it's more about Marathon, which, to the benefit of a lot of people here that are on that committee, came under budget.
Correct.
Why and how did it come under budget, and are there things that we can replicate this time to hopefully cross our fingers and do the same this project?
Yep, great questions, Bill. So even so on the Marathon and on most projects, there's always a point at which we have to do value engineering. So we set the overall budget at the schematic design, which is roughly 30% of the design being completed. And then we have 3 more cost check-ins. So at the end of design development, essentially, 50% or so of the design, we stop, pencils down, do an estimate, both us and the designer, to check where we are. We do it again at 60% construction documents and again at 90%. So there's 3 more checks. At each of those, invariably, costs come up, permitting adds on a curveball that we might not have anticipated, some additional information comes in, codes change that weren't forecasted, and we'll respond to those. We'll bring decisions back to the committee of how to get back to the budget. Those 9 projects that went through the MSBA all went through that. In some cases, they cut $7 to $10 million out of their budgets and still came in over, just because of that crushing 2 years of 12% escalation compounding itself. But under a normal 5%, we can absorb that. We'll monitor and do value engineering, and that is what happened on Marathon. At one point, we were, I think, $4 million over at that DD budget. At one point, it was going to be a red brick building. It was not going to be the finish that you see today. We had a lot of changes that were made to that building from when we originally conceived it to the finished product that you saw, and that was through bid management to try and stay in front of that.
And just to add to that, the other thing that we do as we track those milestones is that we have a contingency that gets added into each of those estimates that reduces over time. And so we'll use that contingency as a benchmark to try and, at SD, there's certain things that are unknown. At DD, there are less things that are unknown. And at CDs, there are even less things that are unknown. And so the contingency is really that chunk of money in the overall estimate that helps to pay for the things that you don't know about yet.
Right, so I think, as I recall, the site was actually sort of best case scenario when we started building on it, right? The site was actually really buildable. And I think we had some contingencies built in for things we might have to do depending on what we found when we started building on it. So those are kind of examples of along the way. Hopefully we get some breaks like that.
And we'll also revisit the marketplace as we progress through design so that we'll be able to provide you updated information as we're making these decisions at each one of those milestones.
And the 2 estimates are help, whether if you go with a general contractor, we'll provide 2 estimates and use that against each other to compare and make sure it's a more accurate and dialed in number. If you choose to bring in a construction manager, you get the benefit of their foresight, but they also try and protect their number because they have a financial obligation to deliver that number. And so the check estimate by the designer and us leverage against that to make sure they're being honest, right? Because we don't want them to protect themselves to your detriment, right? We want the right number on bid day, and we want to challenge them to be as conservative and not risk averse, right? So we want to make sure they're willing to walk the same line you guys are willing to walk to get your full program and not hand you a check back at the end after when you don't need it. You know, we want that money spent when it's needed.
Other questions?
So I just want to bring up kind of where we as a town are in the process of both budget and capital as it relates to cost. So as we know, this committee has not seen or developed or talked about cost yet. However, as part of the budget process and capital plan, we have to put forward a 5 and 10 year capital plan. So there is a placeholder in that 5-year capital plan that has been made public through the school committee presentations 3 times to the select board once, of 120 million. And that is meant to be a placeholder, and it is meant to be transparent to the community that this project exists and that it's out there. But I don't want people to think that that is the number, because it is just a placeholder. Now, this will be presented, this capital plan, multiple times going forward, and I've cautioned the use of that number, but just so the public knows that that number is just a placeholder. It is not something that has come from the building committee. So just clarification for the community, because they're going to hear that number. But again, it's a placeholder. It's an awareness placeholder, if you will.
So, thank you, Susan, because I think that is really important. I mean, what we just heard here is that as placeholder numbers go, we're going to have a lot more trouble getting a really, really accurate placeholder number than we probably would previously on other projects and other conditions.
Right.
And so I know that there are a couple of sort of budget listening sessions that are happening in the next month or so, and we know there will be increasing meetings about the budget, especially as we kick off next year. So I think we probably just want to reiterate to the powers that be in town as those numbers are rolling out. Bill, I'm looking at our appropriation committee representative. Maybe we could connect and figure out how to get to the CFO, and just because to me, I think we need a placeholder number probably in those presentations, but like a really big caveat attached to it, I think would be helpful, so that as people are seeing it, I don't think we want to be at a town meeting next fall and somebody saying, you told me it was going to be $120 million and now it's this.
Exactly.
So if we could figure out how to get that
Conservative
resolved.
estimate.
Well, and to put it in context for where we are in the overall MSBA process, we're going to come back to you at your next meeting with the estimates that were developed for the test fits. And you have to view those in the context of they are estimates that are developed for test fits. So in the same way that the test fit is figuring out whether a building of a certain size fits on a certain site, the budget is an estimate of those assumptions. And this committee will still have the opportunity, as we choose some of those test fit budgets, to move forward to refine those designs into ultimately something that will become your building. And in the same way, we will refine that estimate. So if those estimates come in at a certain place, that is in no way a guarantee that that's what the community of Hopkinton is spending. It is purely an additional data point to allow you to assess one option versus another as you're choosing what you want to move forward.
Yeah, no, understood. I think, so we're fighting the calendar a little bit, because what's happening is, as all those things you just discussed are going on, we will be, the school budget conversations have already been ongoing, the capital plan has been presented, we'll hit the new year, we'll start doing more of the town side budget, which will have long-term capital discussions. So, if we could all control the calendar as we'd like, we would get all this done and have a really good estimate for what this project was going to cost before all of those other conversations were happening. There's no chance that's going to happen. And so we're probably, like, as you're describing those test fits, you're right, and for the committee, it's good to consider that. But it's also good to realize that that's potentially like 5 or 6 numbers that are now gonna be somewhere in a public information packet about this project. And so I think what we really just need to get aligned with all of the departments and committees in town are, how do we want to make sure we're talking about this number so that the community is clear on what we know, on what we don't know yet, and on when we're going to know more. And I think that's what, because I don't want to have one thing being presented in a certain way that an audience thinks, oh, this is what the school's going to cost, and actually know it's, you know, an early estimate, or it's a projection, or it's a placeholder, and we're not ready to kind of put a stamp on that. We need to make sure that that's contextualized for people.
Right, yeah, well said, and I think the timing of that is important, and, you know, no matter what the number is, it's not that exact number, right?
Right.
So it's going to be different. There are many decisions that you will make as a group, and then others will influence in terms of their feedback to sculpt what the final cost of the project may be. And risk mitigation is one of them, right? There are towns that would carry 5% and say, totally feel comfortable with that, we never spend more than 3%. That was true a few years ago. Like, we gave back several $1 million on Marathon. Now they're patting it the opposite way. Like, my 5% should be 10. Taxpayers, if I don't need it, I won't spend it, but it's there, so I don't have to go through the painful process of scheduling another town meeting and explaining why. But we parking lot it within the overall maximum vote that the town brings together. So those are also conversations that you guys will have and make decisions and recommendations on what that number should be that goes back. Any questions on costs? We'll go to PDP if not.
So at the test fit level, can you give a plus minus number, or you don't, it's too early, like a schematic maybe?
We will. I mean, it'll, you know, the HVAC as an example is not going to be a detailed breakdown of all the components, right? It's going to be that HVAC buildings that have these types of systems cost, you know, X dollars a square foot, right? So it's that level of a detail. So we'll break it down by the major components of the building and then summarize it up with lots of contingencies and markups at this point to fill in the gap. So we'll have a number and they'll have a number, and, you know, we'll kind of average that out as to where we think the number is, or we can use the higher end of the range depending on how that shakes out between the options.
I guess my question was, can you give a range of accuracy at the test fit level? Say, this is the number, but it could be plus 50 or to minus 30 or something like
Where
that.
it's most
I don't like to give a range of accuracy at the test fit level because it is a test fit, and it's based on, I keep using the word cartoon because it is. You've seen it, right? There are not hard lines to measure a drawing. There are not topography changes. It doesn't show you where all the ledges you're going to hit are, the pockets of this, pockets of that. I mean, each one of those events can cause spikes in cost, and so we'll have much greater detail for that to dial it in down the road, but not for these costs next week.
That's fair.
where the value of the cost is at the PDP stage is relative to the other options that you're
Right.
considering. If one of them has substantially higher costs for, say, acquiring land, or substantially higher costs for swing space versus the other options, that may be a data point that the committee chooses to weigh more in choosing what options move forward.
All good questions, though.
Other questions?
All right, so we'll step into the next steps process. So the ESBC and the project team have been on track with all the tasks and milestones that we've set out since hiring Perkins over the summer. And I want to go to the next slide. And so just want to remind everybody what the PDP is. So the Preliminary Design Program summarizes the preliminary evaluation of alternatives. That's the test fits that you guys have seen over the past couple of months. Talks about the educational program, which you saw your first view into that. Again, that portion is more to the school department and school committee, but it's a critical piece of this initial delivery. It's the initial space summary template. Bob didn't want you to put your bifocals on and read that tiny font today, but that summary chart will be included in the packet, and you'll see the final version of that as part of the next meeting to review. But the existing conditions you saw early on and the site development, those are presentations that Dan and his team have made. So you can see that with the PDP, the first 3 steps we've accomplished, and we've now shown you the start of the next 2. That's the summary level of what goes into this next step. And the preferred schematic report is the next stage, and that's where we'll focus the next 3 months from here on out after that. Next slide. So again, just in big picture, I wanted to talk about what we've accomplished. So at the summer, when we hired Perkins, we set out to do borings, topography, the site survey, traffic counts, assessment of existing conditions, building material testing for hazmat on the existing building. We've completed all those. We have one more round of borings to do at the Hayden Row site. We've also done preliminary test fit options, many iterations of those. You've seen those. We've had educational workshops. We've provided you with a draft copy of the educational program, as well as the space summary template, just starting to talk about tonight. That's why those ones are highlighted in blue. So everything in black here are kind of complete and behind us. And the 3 items in blue are in the next 2-week horizon, which is we start to talk about the ED program, the space summary template, and the remaining community forum. And so once all these steps are completed, we set out and achieve the goals we had in order to get to the PDP level. So I think it's important to just remind the public that we're on track and are ready to go to that next stage. Next. So what does a PDP look like? Included in your packet, we had the 2 to 3 page table of contents. There's a lot of data that goes in there. It's really a summary of the stuff we presented to date and maturations of that. It's broken down into these kind of big categories as an introduction narrative. I'll say that the Perkins team are going to put together the lion's share of this. Compass puts together a good chunk, and we help support the district in your elements. But the design team will draft the introduction narrative with our support. The educational program comes from the school department. Space summary comes from the design team, as well as the existing conditions, the site redevelopment, and then the preliminary evaluation of alternatives, as well as narratives that go with each of these sections. The local actions and approvals comes from the district, and that's simply a letter that goes for a couple of pages. And what that is the MSBA wants to know that you've made this process public, right? That you've had advertised public meetings like tonight, you've had community forums, you've made it available in whatever ways you do. You know, this committee has taken the steps to put ourselves on HCAM that could be taped and rewatched. Same with the community forums. And the MSBA wants to know that because the average person who comes late to the process says, I was never told about any of this when it comes to the week before the town meeting floor. And they have a list now of, here you go, citizen. We've been witnessing all along that the building committee has done all these meetings. They've been available at multiple types of forums and vehicles, both virtual and physical. And so that will be submitted at this milestone report as well as the next 2, because it becomes the roadmap. You always have that one disgruntled resident, and MSBA has learned long ago, keep your list long, and it makes it clear that everybody does have the way to be involved in the process and can be re-engaged at multiple points in the job. And then lastly, just the appendix is just a mountain of paperwork that the design team has assembled for you over that period of time. And that was the last slide. Yeah, any questions? Before I give it over to Dan on the PDP. So at your next meeting on December 6th, will be Dan and I will assemble a link to send to you. We're targeting Friday the 2nd. We'll send a shared link that'll have an outline kind of folder structure for all the different elements that go into that PDP. And as new pieces come in, we can drop those in as well, as it becomes kind of a living document over that week. And then we'll get in front of you on the 6th, look for your authorization and approval to submit it. If the ed plan comes in afterwards as a final version, we'll drop that in there. And traditionally, the vote we tee up there would be you authorize the OPM to submit that on your behalf, subject to any minor modifications through the chair and the consultants, as we'll refine and wordsmith and do other things those last couple of days leading up to the 9th. Any questions on the timeline and process of that? All right, so I'll turn it over to Dan.
Hang on, so it's going to jump ahead in the agenda a little bit, but to tee up, one thing I was just thinking about dates, and I looked up on the town website, December 6th, our meeting would directly conflict with the select board meeting. And I'm wondering if, given what we're being asked, what we're thinking of doing in terms of approving the PDP, if we wouldn't be better off looking at the possibility of either doing the 5th or the 7th, so that, because I think that's probably one that our select board and representative and town manager would want to be in attendance at. So I think we might want to avoid that. I know it's a tight window because we've really got to have it done by the 7th, effectively, right, Jeff?
We've got to, yeah, I mean, the report has to be into the MSBA's hand on the 9th.
Right, and then there's a school committee meeting on the 8th.
Yeah.
So, right. Yeah, so it's really, if we could do the 5th or the 7th, otherwise, I think we just
5th would probably be better. Because it give you a little time to get anything that doesn't
I thought you
slip.
might, I was gonna say you might need more time to the 7th. I was gonna give you the other way, but depends on how much you can pull together on Friday. Let's go.
I think we'll be in good shape.
You guys are good working through Thanksgiving, right?
I can do either.
Yeah.
Whatever works for your committee.
Either works for me too.
I don't think they're gonna give you
Either
a revision.
Okay.
No.
Carol, Susan, Ann?
5 and 7,
Yeah.
perfect.
Okay, well then, I'm gonna put it back to you guys. What do you prefer schedule-wise? Just pick one.
I could go with either. What about you? Does it matter?
Nope.
Which one do you like?
Or rock, paper, scissors?
Right. Do you want to give
Depends on the amount of
yourselves the
revisions
extra
you're
day? I
gonna do.
feel like it's a huge
Well, they're trying to
document.
figure out which, they're trying to figure out which side is gonna get the extra day. After edit time or the before prep time?
Yeah, we'll go with the 7th.
7th? Okay, sold.
Final answer.
All right.
Carol, can you'll let Georgette know?
Yes, I will.
Okay, thank you. All right, test fits.
So from the test fit perspective, what I really wanted to do is just show everybody what we have sent out for the estimator to look at, which ones we selected to push forward. So not all of them went, because that would be an awful lot, but the one from each of the site and a 2-3 option. So that you can see we selected this one from the 67 East Main, the further back version of the Hayden Row one, because that would have you capture more of the utilities and more of the site work with this option, and then the Elm Street, the 2-3 option. For the 2-4s, very similar, just the larger versions of the building. And then for the ad renos, we sent all 3 of these forward. So the thing is that when we get these prices back, when we next meet, we're going to want to try to whittle these down a little bit. Hopefully, we would suggest maybe taking off 2 of these ad renos. And lastly, I did have something new about the topography of the East Main Street site.
Sorry, before you get there, so you're suggesting potentially we might want to shave off a couple of the ad renos?
Shave off a couple of the ad renos.
On the, like, what's a good number to send? I mean, is 6 new construction too many, or?
Well, let him do the next slide, then we'll talk about it.
Okay, cool.
So on the East Main Street. So in looking at this site and sending this out to the estimators, one of the things we wanted to try to capture was a kind of a gross idea of the site work here. There is a very significant grade change between 5th Street going down towards the west of probably around 50 feet over the building's footprint, which is significant and will require terracing, and it'll also retaining walls to make up these grades, and a number of different things happening inside the building. So it wouldn't just be a building on a flat site, it's going to be built into the grade. That's going to have a cost premium to it. So that was what we did include that into the PDP cost estimate, so you will see that reflected, which would be another thing that this site is going to reflect. It will also reflect that you're purchasing the site that is not currently owned, and that does not have town sewer, and it would require a septic system. So this has several things that the other sites do not have. But I just wanted everyone to be aware of that this is very significant for a cost driver from a site perspective on this particular site.
So that last point about you don't own the property, like, we'll be looking for some guidance on what you think the fair market value is. On Marathon, we kind of knew going into it what those prices were, because you would really engage those landowners. On this one, it's been just knocking on the door that we're looking at the site, so I'm not sure what the right number is to carry for that. You don't have to answer that on the spot. But what we think we should carry for the cost premium of procuring an additional site, just to put the apples to apples comparisons of the 3.
So we don't have to answer it on the spot. When do we have to answer it?
Well, you got to decide by your next meeting what we should put for a placeholder.
Okay.
Right, so that when we present the numbers back to you, we have an assumption that it's a $3 million land purchase, or whatever it is for the number, for the acreage that's there that would be being purchased at that time.
Yeah, because one of the things I usually think of the PDP pricing as almost parametrically between, like, something's $1 and something's 50 cents and something's $3 or $4. Not even thinking about it as in the millions that you'll see on the estimates. but just in relation to one another, what do they look like? So that piece, that data point is gonna drive that number for that 67 East Main Street.
So,
So to answer the question about how many we move forward,
yeah, so to answer the question, so the decision on your next meeting is not only to submit the PDP, but also to whittle down the list. The MSBA program only requires you carry forward a code upgrade, which is, we talked about earlier, just what does it cost to bring that building up to current standards and not meet anything else you need it to do. So we have that in the back pocket, we'll provide that. And then it's an addition renovation and one new construction option. That's the bare minimum, or you could bring a lot of options to the table. We know the ad reno only meets the 2-3 grade configuration, so the ad reno gets included will focus on the 2-3 grade configuration, because by the time you need the size for the 3 grade configuration, you're better off serving new. There's not much to maintain in the original structure. So we would envision you whittling down the ad renos to one of the 3 options. You don't need to, if 2 of them were real, looked great, I'd say, carry more than one, but, they all have significant trade-offs and compromises. And so I think you should focus on one ad reno. And then to Dan's point, if the topography and the changes of the other site on Main Street becomes a significant challenge, maybe that's the site that drops off the list at that point. Because over the next couple of months, the design team will be doing a lot more focused work, and it would be better to have them focus on 2 sites if those are really viable, and the third one is less viable. So, I envision it that those are the sites that, being maintained, Elmwood and Hayden Row, because of the challenges we're talking about here, and then one of the ad reno options. And we would include the new construction at both the 2-3 and the 2-4. So essentially, we're talking maybe 5 options, an ad reno, and then a 2-3 and a 2-4 at Hayden Row, and a 2-3 and a 2-4 at Elmwood. Just to put it in perspective.
Just a question on the East Main Street site. So the costs are likely to be higher, but also the unknowns or the contingency would be higher, I would think, because it's an unexplored site compared to the other 2 sites.
That's correct, an excellent point. So we've done a phase 1 environmental assessment of the sites that the town controls. And so we know that those are clean and don't have contaminants in it. We don't know about the previous uses of that other property that's not owned by the town. And we don't know about other topography changes. We haven't set foot on the ground.
Right.
We've looked at aerial mapping, and that's what Dan's putting on there, but there are other nooks and crannies that we don't know about with that site that could be a challenge.
Other questions? So is everyone clear on our next meeting, what we're going to have and what we're going to be asked to do as a committee? Because I think as Jeff outlined, right, so this is going to be a critical decision point. Voting the submission of that PDP keeps us on our current track for our timeline of approval of bringing it before the town sometime next fall. This isn't the only time that we'll be able to pull the ripcord and say that this timeline doesn't work for us anymore, but it is critical if we want to stay on that right now that we do this vote then.
Is there a way, the community engagement has been awesome, but I'm wondering if there's a way that we could kind of be like, last call, we got to make some tough decisions next week. Is there a way that we could get that message out there so folks know we have to pick the sites that we're sending, the options that we're sending? We have to, this is like one of the first sort of, I think, really big milestones. Like, we narrowed it down, and here's what we got, and this is what we're submitting in this first document that we have to submit to the state. I don't know.
I mean, I think, so I'm open to any ideas. I think what we could do is just try to sort of do what we've been trying to do for the forums.
Right. Is the forum before? It is,
The forum is
right?
before
Yeah.
next Wednesday.
So
Right.
this is actually week after next.
Okay.
Right, so there's a whole, so that we have to submit it. So the forum is next Wednesday, then this will be the week after. So I think we can talk about it a lot in the forum.
Okay. It's not really part of the original intent of that forum, though, right? Grade configuration, I guess, right? Is that the grade configuration?
We're putting all the information out there. We're starting the dialogue. The grade configuration decision is not happening at the next, at your next vote. You're going to keep both options open. You may choose to whittle one site off the equation, I think the broad town has known all along that Hayden Row and Elmwood are the two most viable sites.
Sure.
And you as a committee turned over every stone in town to say, is there something else out there? So I still think you're on track with
Okay.
keeping the message moving, but you are opening the spectrum to the town. We have a big community forum on the 30th. We're still trying to get more people at that one. You also step into the school committee's venue on the 1st by having the grade configuration and the ed plan discussion, so that picks up its usual round of viewers that can then get them excited about the project aspect of things versus just school committee business, and then come back
That's
in front
always
of you.
exciting, Jeff. Just so you know.
Still handing your thunder, Jen.
Okay.
And then,
Yeah.
we're having community forums in January. Right now we have one scheduled. We talked about having another. One of the ideas in the visioning session that we had last week was to get in front of the senior center with a daytime meeting. So we've tried nighttime meetings. We've had good remote participation, but less in person. Let's try a daytime meeting, making that as an open venue as well, to see who else we can pick up at off hour times, to see if we can
You're right.
drum up more interest.
Maybe we've done what we can do.
Well, and I think, so in a discussion we had earlier today, one of the things that was pointed out was, so the in-person attendance at our forums and certainly our meetings has been less than we probably looking for, but if you look at what metrics we have around the views on YouTube and some of the responses to the polls that we left open on Mentimeter, we are getting, there were, I think, almost 100 responses to the last poll.
107.
107. Last time I checked, which was admittedly a while ago, I think we had well over 150 views of the forum. So it does seem like there is some engagement out there in the community. I think your point is really important, though, because we're getting to the part where we need people not just to be watching, we need them to be talking to us.
Right.
So I think if we can figure out how to drive the messaging that way, which is, yeah, we've tried to make this as convenient as possible. What we really need right now is people to show up and give feedback.
Right.
So I think we can kind of do a blitz for that for the next meeting.
Okay.
At the last community forum, I took our PDF that we had to invite people, and we put it all over Facebook, and I had gotten a few names from visioning people and sent it out to them, and they put it in their little Facebook groups too. And then after the meeting, we did a secondary post to put the link out on YouTube again, and again, just different people, one of the dads, a few of the moms, and we tried to get it on different groups, and I think that helped with viewership. And then I made it an event so that people could like it, and then they would get a reminder in their social media as well. And then people were commenting and even asking questions after the meeting under the comments. Then people who had watched were commenting back, here's what I read on this post in this forum. So I do think that did help a little bit. And hopefully if we can even give more information, and I could even be more specific in the update about what they need their input on, I think that could be helpful. It seemed like it actually kind of worked a bit better.
Yeah, I think that's great. So as you were talking about that, I just forwarded the
Yes,
flyer
thank you.
to the
I saw
entire
that.
ESBC. And maybe we can put together some talking points to go with that, which I can do probably tonight and send out to the group, and
That
we
would
can
be
just
great.
start sharing that to all your, because I think, look, I mean, we can do a lot of, Lisa posted in a bunch of places locally today. I've got some hard copies I'm gonna go post in some places tomorrow. The word of mouth, sort of the individual connections, is what is the most effective way to get this done. So
I think the visioning group will be really helpful with
Yeah.
that too.
Maybe an announcement at the Thanksgiving game over the PA speaker.
That's a great idea.
That's a different demographic, right? The dieharders,
Yep.
the Hillers, right?
All right, other test fit questions? I mean, we really got to get another picture of Elmwood for the.
This is just an overall snapshot of time. Again, just showing that we're on track, to John's point. You had your team consultants hired. The green things represent the community forums. We've got 2 behind us. We have another one scheduled for next week. We get to our PDP milestone. We have at least one in January. We talked just now about adding another one in the early January timeframe as well. And then we'll submit the PSR in March. And then the schematic design report is targeted for being submitted the end of the summer, and then getting into a town meeting vote potentially in November, depending on how things all shake out. And that brings us into a year plus of design and then into construction at the start of 2025 potentially. So we are on track for that overall schedule, and just want to remind you and the viewers at home, what the overall timeline is. And that was it for schedule.
We talked about doing this one, right?
Either way, it's good.
Yep. So as far as the community forum, the agenda that we have is to share the visioning. So Manuel was here at the last ESBC meeting. It'll be a similar share, report out. He'll include the most recent, the final, the third visioning session. The options updates will be presented, so that'll be the full options, not just the ones that Dan showed. We'll have also have the traffic discussion and presentation, and Vinod Kalkari was here also at the last school building committee meeting, so it'll be the content that he shared. The grade configuration and the system-wide study will be pretty much what you saw tonight, and happy to respond and make edits to that as well before we get to the 30th. And then the educational thoughts is probably a better name for this. Don't have the right words, but Carol's going to share a lot of what she's been speaking to or writing in the educational program.
Sure. Yeah, and I think we've talked a lot about what's in there, but we can really drill down on that night too, so that the public can hear where we are with all kinds of curriculum instruction, extracurriculars, transportation, traffic, so it'll be a great night.
And the other thing that we don't have prepared that will tie into this last piece will be a bit of conversation engagement into a Mentimeter forum, and something that can stay open for weeks after the event so that we can continue to collect information. We don't have exactly what that is, but we'll be working on that.
I guess my only concern is it's a lot of information. What is the goal in the previous community forums? It's half presentation, half discussion, 45 and 45 time-wise. I don't know how, if it's the same information we've all digested here today and the traffic information from the last meeting, that can't be done. That'd be difficult to do in 45 minutes. So are there shorter versions of all of these to squeeze it in? Or are you just thinking take more time to push all the information out and leave a little less time for discussion?
It's going to be a longer presentation. It's a great question, Bill. We should talk about the balance of time that we need to look at. And I think this forum, especially if we get better attendance or better viewership, we can leave the Q&A open longer and stay as a longer night. I think it is important to get this volume of information out there, not just for that evening, but for the viewers at home that can kind of watch it. But you're right, it's a lot of information. It includes what you saw here and at your past 3 meetings. So, there's looking at the slide deck, there's 80 slides, right? Even at,
Attention spans
right, yeah.
are,
It's a lot of data to go through, right? But it's important to get it out there. To Jen's point, we want to make sure people hear the message and that they have time to get back to us. And there's still vehicles outside of the meeting, such as the email and the web address and all that, to get back to us with questions if it can't be answered there. But I think if we have attendance and questions are coming in the forum, we'll stay, right? We'll just keep answering the questions to make sure that people get heard.
Other questions about the forum agenda?
Do you want to go through the vision?
I think the Mentimeter form is an important one, because we seem to get more engagement with the Mentimeter survey rather than in-person attendance. So I think the questions we ask will be important.
Yeah, and clearly the numbers show that the ability to leave it open is beneficial in terms of getting public feedback.
And one of the things that's important to bring up about this forum in particular is this is really an opportunity to push information out. That's really our goal. We know that there's going to be follow-up conversations about a lot of these things that we're talking about, particularly around grade configuration. So it's really setting the table for those further discussions to happen within the town, particularly in the school committee, so that we can get all that information out into the public and engage them in that discussion that we know is going to happen.
And hopefully find out a little bit of
which of these resonates with
Yeah.
people, right? So as we think about where we need to drill down further, is traffic a huge concern for everybody, or is it, are people not as worried about that as others? Like, are we? Yeah, I think that one's going to be, but it was just an example. So I think that'll be beneficial. I'm wondering, just from an order perspective in my head, should we flip system-wide study and grade configuration? Because does the system-wide study drive the discussion of the grade configuration? Because it's sort of the why we're talking about grade configuration, right?
It informs it.
Yes.
Yeah, and so it just jumped out at me as I think that's sort of out of order in the conversation.
I think as we've developed the content that we want to present, they've slowly become merged.
I think that's probably right too. I mean, you could merge them.
Right, we started off with that order because the MSBA project charge is the 2 grade configurations, and a byproduct of that is really understanding how that impacts the overall. So that was the original thought of why we're kind of ordering it, but we easily can flip them.
I'm just and I think that makes sense for like the people around this table, but I'm thinking of people who are not as connected to this project. It's why are we talking about grade configuration? We're talking about it because of the facility challenges that we have. I think sometimes we gotta remember that not everybody is as engaged in these conversations and I think that'll help. If we start talking about 2, 3, 4, people will be wondering why, and then. Anything else?
Yeah.
All right, so we included a partial draft of that. We got more stuff from Manuel and the visioning, and we'll send you guys an updated copy of the slideshow presentation. So if you have any comments, you can always email them back to Bob and I prior to the forum.
Where did you drop off hard copies of the forum flyers so far?
Hillers, the library,
Town Hall. It was like 5 or 6
We're
places.
doing senior center tomorrow.
We're doing Senior Center tomorrow, Starbucks, Dunkin', Muffin House, Price Chopper.
Does Chamber of Commerce have a place you could put it up? No,
I
they
don't
don't
know if
have an
they
actual
do.
place,
I don't
right?
think they have an actual place.
Do you want to do a few of the daycares in town to get like that younger?
That'd be a good idea.
Yeah, so like Next Generation, TLC, Building Blocks.
About the senior center, did you mention?
Yeah, Senior Center, we're gonna get that one. Yeah, that's a good idea.
Those are all right there.
Yep.
We can take those.
Okay.
Yeah.
We can take some.
Yeah.
Yeah, let's try to get it out to as many places as possible. So, if you have any ideas or thoughts. I think the only thing left on the agenda is meeting schedule, which we may have already covered.
Covered it, just you already covered by moving our next meeting. So our next meeting is now on the 7th.
Yes.
And then we had a placeholder previously the following week, the 13th. I figured we'd keep it there as opposed to bumping up closer to the holidays because I do want to get a second meeting in December before we break for the holidays. So we'd have just a meeting on the 7th and the 13th. 13th should already be on your calendars. So, just because we get the report in on Friday, the dust doesn't settle, work keeps going, and we'll drill down deeper in some conversations on the 13th.
And important distinction, our actual next meeting is November 30th, the forum.
The forum.
So, yeah, so that's the next sort of event. I want to make sure and then the big one on the 7th.
And the forum, to clarify, the forum is a joint meeting between this committee and the school committee because both of them have a role in the overall system-wide study and grade configuration discussion for New Elmwood.
Yes.
So the tours, that's been taken off the schedule? The all-day tour that was going to be December 9th or 10th or?
There's probably 2 versions of tours. I think the one that was in the original schedule was related to sustainability and would happen in the next phase.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Anyone else have anything they want to raise or cover tonight? Okay. If not, then I will seek a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Okay. Motion by Mike. Is there a second? Second by Tiffany. All those in favor?
Yes.
Aye. Opposed? No one's ever opposed to that one. So we are adjourned at 7:48 PM. Thank you to HCAM for broadcasting this so that and recording it so everyone can access it. And we look forward to seeing as many people as possible on November 30th at the high school auditorium for our next public forum. Thank you.
One, two, three, four.